today. I am impressed by that. It's an interesting story, this story of communion, this story of the Eucharist, this story of the Lord's Supper. All of that background into our celebration of communion is tied up into the grand climax of what Jesus is willing to do when he goes to the cross. The disciples are making preparations to eat the Passover meal, a celebration recognizing that God had saved the Hebrew people while they were in slavery in Egypt under Pharaoh. God had saved them from the 10th plague, the angel of death, that Moses had foretold would come to each house and kill the firstborn, unless the blood of the Lamb had been placed on the doorway. If the blood of the Lamb was placed on the doorway, then the angel of death would pass over, and all in that household would be spared. They are celebrating God saving the people from death through the blood of the Lamb. In their celebration is a time of reconciliation and gathering and eating and celebration. It is not unlike Thanksgiving in the United States, but with a little bit of an Old Testament twist to it. It should be a joyous celebration of God's triumph over death and life. Instead, this Passover meal turns out to be a dark time of betrayal. Jesus is sitting at the table with some of his closest friends and allies. These are part of the inner circle that Jesus traveled with. These are part of the inner circle that Jesus had taught with and gone to the people and spent time with. These are people that Jesus trusted. These are people that Jesus loved. These are people that Jesus is betrayed by. Jesus is flat out betrayed to the Roman authorities by someone sitting at the very table. And Jesus knows who it is. However, the others sitting around the table, they don't know who it is. And when Jesus announces that the betrayer is at that table, they make a great show of denial. Each and every one of them tried to make certain Jesus heard their individual claim to innocence. Verse 22, and they became greatly distressed and began to say to him, one after another, surely not I, Lord. They were more concerned with establishing their own innocence than they were that the innocent one was going to go to the cross. They were more concerned with their own looking good than Jesus' betrayal. That betrayal that leads to his crucifixion. That betrayal that leads to his death on the cross. They knew this. They knew this. Jesus had been telling them, this is how it's going to go. Remember that part when Peter says, no, that can't be. And Jesus tells Peter, get behind me, Satan. They know how this is going to play out. They've already heard it from Jesus himself. And yet they focus their energy on claims of innocence rather than giving the slightest thought about Jesus going to the cross. And all this is before they've eaten with Jesus. All this is before Jesus has broken the bread and poured the wine. All this is before Jesus explained he would be broken and he would be poured out for the forgiveness of our sins. All this is before. They had betrayed and denied him one by one, and Jesus still eats with them. They had betrayed and denied him one by one, and Jesus still breaks the bread and pours out the wine. They had denied him, and Jesus still pours himself out for the forgiveness of their sins, for the forgiveness of our sins. Jesus had reconciled them to himself, even before they knew it. Jesus knows all about the denials. Jesus knows all about the betrayals. Jesus knows he's about to die on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins. Jesus knows they will be saved from their sins by his blood, the blood of the Lamb. Like the generations before, they too would be saved by the blood of the Lamb. Jesus shares one last meal with them, blessing himself to each of them as they ate the bread and drank the wine. And he reconciles them to himself. They didn't deserve it. They don't even recognize it yet. But he joins with them in one last supper. That's the reconciliation that we experience when we come to the meal that Jesus has prepared for each of us. Reconciliation that comes from a grace so strong that through Christ's death on the cross, our sins are forgiven and we are reconciled to God. We too are saved by the blood of the Lamb. We too are saved by the one who would be broken and who would bleed for us. In Jesus' sacrifice, we are reconciled to God, and in that reconciliation, we are freed. Free to go into the world as a person forgiven of our sins. And in that forgiveness, we are able to then forgive others. The truth of it is, each of us are sinners. And as sinners, we know what the weight of our sins feel like. We know what it feels like to have sinned against God and others, and to feel the weight of that sin dragging us down. And we know that feeling of release when God forgives our sins and that weight is taken from us. We also know what it is like to have been sinned against and to feel the weight of the grudge we hold dragging us down. We also know the release we experience when we forgive that sin and we release that grudge. That's how it's supposed to work. We are forgiven for our sins so that we can reconcile with others. That doesn't mean we necessarily forget what has been done to us. In some cases, it's a good course of action, just forget about it. In other cases, we should not forget. It simply means that we're not carrying the weight of someone else's sin against us through the grudge we don't release. When we do that, when we hold on to those grudges, it becomes a race to the bottom. Instead, we have the example God has set before us in Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Instead, we have the example of Christ sitting at the table with his betrayer. Instead, we have the example of Christ setting the table before us. He has taken the weight of our sin on his shoulders so that we no longer have to carry it on ours. Remember that when you share the peace and are reminded to reconcile to one another. Remember that every time you come to the table and are reminded that you are reconciled with God. Remember that when you hear Jesus say, "Remember me." To God be the glory. Amen. I want you to please stand as you are comfortable in it.